The most common sound in the world was the roar of the ocean, but for Thomas Vance in the winter of 1871, that sound had become a countdown to a massacre. On a jagged, salt-eroded shelf of Oregon granite, the Tillamook Rock Lighthouse stood as the only barrier between 1,000 tons of ship-grade oak and the crushing weight of the North Pacific. Inside the lantern room, the air was a thick, cloying mixture of hot whale oil, ozone, and the metallic scent of heated brass. Outside, a hurricane-force gale was screaming, slamming against the thick glass panes with such violence that the entire iron dome groaned on its foundations. For the 200 sleeping passengers aboard the iron-hulled steamer SS Vancouver, the world was a chaotic abyss of freezing water and black sky. They had no idea they were drifting. They had no idea that a cross-current was dragging them toward the terrible Tilly, a reef of volcanic rock designed by nature to shred anything that floated. Their only hope was the rhythmic, hypnotic pulse of the lighthouse, a beam of light that promised a safe harbor, provided it kept moving. At exactly 2:14 in the morning, the rhythm died. A sound like a high-powered rifle shot echoed through the hollow stone tower, vibrating up from the mechanical floor to the very tip of the spire. Thomas Vance, standing near the oil reservoir, felt the vibration in his teeth before he heard the catastrophe. The central clockwork mechanism, the intricate system of weighted pulleys and bronze gears that kept the 2-ton Fresnel lens in a constant, silent rotation, had suffered a catastrophic failure. The main iron drive shaft, weakened by decades of microscopic salt corrosion and the relentless pressure of the storm's vibrations, had simply snapped in two. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the roar of the hurricane. The massive carousel of glass and brass, a masterpiece of 19th-century engineering, slowed to a crawl and then jerked to a complete halt. The lighthouse, the only landmark for 50 miles, had transformed from a sweeping sentinel into a static, useless spear of light pointed helplessly into the void of the storm. Thomas sprinted up the final flight of spiral stairs, his lungs burning and his heart hammering against his ribs. When he burst into the gallery, he saw the wreckage. Jagged shards of bronze lay scattered across the floor, glowing like gold in the lamplight. He looked at the drive shaft. The break was clean and absolute. He knew the SS Vancouver was out there, blinded by the rain, searching for the flash that defined this coast. If the captain saw a stationary light, he would assume it was a distant star or a campfire on the shore, leading him to steer the ship directly into the teeth of the reef. There were no spare parts in the tower. There was no telegraph to call for aid, and no ship could survive the approach to the rock in this weather. Thomas looked at his hands, calloused, grease-stained and trembling, and then at the 2-ton framework of the lens. He realized the brutal physics of his situation. For the next 10 hours until dawn, he could not be a keeper. He would have to be the machine itself. He stepped onto the narrow, oil-slicked ledge of the rotating pedestal. He braced his heavy leather boots against the iron railing and pressed his right shoulder against the freezing brass frame. He took a single deep breath of the kerosene-heavy air, let out a primal roar that was lost in the wind, and shoved. The 2-ton mountain of glass groaned, a sickening sound of metal grinding on metal, and moved a single agonizing inch. The light began to sweep once more, but the cost had just begun to be tallied. The rotation of a Fresnel lens is not merely a feat of strength. It is a brutal calculation of timing. To the sailors on the horizon, the lighthouse must pulse with a specific signature, a flash every 10 seconds. If the light stalls, it is a star. If it spins too fast, it is a chaotic flicker that offers no direction. Thomas Vance, now braced against the 2-ton cage of glass, began to count. 1, 2, 3. With every beat, he threw the entirety of his body weight against the cold brass frame. The lens groaned, its bearings grinding with the friction of the broken shaft, resisting every inch of his effort. By the 3rd hour, the initial surge of adrenaline that had fueled his desperate panic began to evaporate, replaced by a dull, throbbing ache that radiated from his shoulder blades to the very base of his spine. The lantern room, once his sanctuary, had transformed into a mechanical torture chamber. The heat from the burning whale oil lamps was suffocating, reaching over 100 degrees near the wick, yet every time the hurricane-force gale blasted against the exterior glass, A freezing draft would slice through the iron seams, chilling the sweat on his skin until it felt like ice. The physical toll was becoming visible. Thomas's heavy leather boots began to lose their grip on the iron pedestal, which was now slick with a treacherous film of spilled lamp oil and saltwater condensation. To survive, he had to adapt. In a moment of frantic ingenuity, he stripped the heavy wool shirt from his back, tearing it into thick strips and wrapping them around his feet and hands to create traction against the polished metal. Now working in his thin, sweat-soaked undershirt, his skin turned a raw, angry purple where it pressed against the unyielding brass framework. The storm outside only grew in its malevolence. A massive rogue wave, driven by 70-mile-per-hour winds, struck the base of the Tillamook Rock with the force of a tectonic shift. The entire stone tower vibrated with a low, bone-shaking frequency. The vibration caused the massive lens to jump slightly on its track, nearly pinning Thomas against the outer gallery glass. He gasped as his ribs screamed in protest, the air knocked out of his lungs. But he could not, stop his stride. If the rotation ceased for even 60 seconds, the ship's captain would lose his bearing, and the SS Vancouver would be swallowed by the breakers. Through a salt-streaked pane of glass, Thomas caught a glimpse of a faint, flickering amber light on the horizon. It wasn't a star. It was the masthead light of the steamer. His heart sank as he realized the vessel was much closer than he had estimated, and it was drifting at a terrifying angle. It was headed directly for the Reaper's Reef, a graveyard of sunken hulls and jagged stone just 3 miles to the north. Thomas closed his eyes, gritted his teeth until they felt like they might shatter, and leaned into the metal once more. He was no longer a man of flesh and blood. He was the gears, the clockwork, and the only heartbeat the lighthouse had left. By the 6th hour of continuous grueling labor, the physical world began to dissolve into a fever dream of salt and iron. The rhythmic counting, 1, 2, 3, which had started as a tool for precision, had transformed into a hollow, haunting mantra that felt entirely detached from Thomas Vance's own consciousness. His muscles were no longer screaming in the sharp, urgent way they had at midnight. They had gone numb, replaced by a cold, leaden weight that threatened to pull his skeletal frame to the floor with every staggering step. His vision began to fracture, the brilliant, concentrated white light of the oil lamp refracting through the 1,000 hand-cut glass prisms of the Fresnel lens until the room seemed to be filled with shimmering, spectral ghosts of light that danced across the curved walls. Every single push was a desperate battle of human will against the cold, unyielding laws of physics. The 2-ton lens had developed a high-pitched, agonizing metallic shriek as it scraped against the debris of the damaged track, a sound like a rusted needle drilling directly into the base of his skull. Yet he had to ignore it. He had to keep the pace. The atmosphere inside the lantern room was becoming a lethal trap. With the lighthouse's natural ventilation system failing and the storm sealing every iron seam of the tower tight, the fumes from the burning whale oil grew thick, greasy, and suffocating. Thomas began to experience the terrifying first stages of oxygen deprivation and carbon monoxide poisoning. His mind, starved for air and crushed by exhaustion, began to betray him. He started to see figures moving in the peripheral shadows. Men he had known long ago in the service, or perhaps the psychic echoes of the sailors who had already perished on this very reef over the decades, standing in the dark corners of the gallery and watching his struggle with hollow, expectant eyes. He shook his head violently, spraying sweat, grime, and salt water against the glass, trying to snap his focus back to the brutal, mechanical reality of the task. He was the only thing living in a room of dying machinery. At the 8th hour, the SS Vancouver reached its moment of ultimate reckoning. Through a temporary, jagged clearing in the freezing sleet, Thomas caught a glimpse of the ship's masthead light tilting at a terrifying, precarious angle. The vessel was caught in the death grip of the coastal current, being pulled sideways toward a cluster of jagged rocks known as the Black Teeth. The ship was blowing its steam whistle, a faint, mournful, and desperate sound that was barely audible over the relentless thunder of the Pacific. It was a cry for help from 200 souls who were currently huddled in their cabins, praying to a God they couldn't see, having no idea that their only savior was a man half dead, stripped to his rags, pushing a mountain of glass in a room filled with toxic chemical smoke. Then, the inevitable happened. His legs finally gave out. The tendons in his knees seemed to snap like dry wood, and Thomas collapsed onto his knees, his forehead hitting the cold brass railing with a sickening, heavy thud. The massive lens immediately began to slow, its heavy, rotating shadow creeping across the room like a predator reclaiming its territory. For a few horrifying seconds, the world went silent. The temptation to just stay down, to let the cold iron floor take his weight and let the darkness take the ship, was overwhelming. He closed his eyes, and the peace of total surrender felt like a warm, seductive blanket. But as he drifted toward a final, fatal unconsciousness, the vibration of another massive rogue wave hitting the tower's base jolted his spine. He felt the needle-sharp spray of the sea on his face through a cracked pane of glass. He wasn't finished. He forced his trembling hands to grip the brass rail, his fingernails bleeding and torn as they clawed at the metal for any scrap of leverage. He jammed his bruised, likely dislocated shoulder back into the frame, his teeth bared in a silent, jagged snarl of pure defiance. He didn't count anymore. He didn't think about the ship, the passengers, or the time remaining until dawn. He simply became a piston, a gear of raw flesh and fractured bone, shoving the light back into the darkness, one agonizing inch at a time. The 10th hour brought a terrifying atmospheric shift. The storm had reached its apex, and the barometric pressure dropped so low that the oil lamps inside the lens flickered and gasped, threatened by the very lack of oxygen Thomas himself was fighting for. He was no longer a man of conscious thought. He had become a machine of bone and bleeding sinew. His right shoulder had finally given way, the joint dislocated and hanging at an agonizing, unnatural angle. But he had managed to wedge his entire torso into the brass frame, using his skeletal structure as a mechanical lever to keep the 2-ton mass sliding forward. He didn't count anymore. He simply exhaled a ragged, bloody wheeze with every shove. 1, 2, 3. The rhythm was the only thing holding the fractured pieces of his sanity together. Outside, the SS Vancouver had reached the critical point of its journey. Through the rain-lashed glass, Thomas watched as the steamer fought the cross-current, its hull dipping precariously low into the white, churning troughs of the Pacific breakers. He could see the explosive sea spray from the Reaper's Reef hitting the ship's lower deck. It was a matter of feet between life and a watery grave. With one last, desperate push that tore the remaining ligaments in his good shoulder, Thomas forced the lens through its final arc of the night. As the beam swept across the water, it illuminated the ship's bridge for a split second. He saw the captain's silhouette, arm raised in a frantic signal for a hard turn to starboard. The SS Vancouver groaned, its engines straining until the black smoke from its funnels turned a hellish red, and slowly, the bow began to swing away from the teeth of the reef. It had cleared the rocks by less than 20 yards. As the first cold, gray light of dawn began to bleed through the retreating storm clouds, the hurricane's fury finally broke. The wind died down to a hollow, ghostly moan, and the sea transitioned from a churning abyss to a restless, slate-gray expanse. The SS Vancouver was now a safe distance out at sea, its foghorn blowing 3 long, triumphant blasts of gratitude toward the tower, a sound that signaled the end of the longest night in Oregon history. Thomas Vance didn't celebrate. He couldn't. His hands were frozen in a claw-like grip on the brass rail, his skin literally bonded to the metal by dried blood, salt, and the intense cold of the gallery. When the relief keeper finally managed to climb the spiral stairs at 7:00 a.m., he found a scene of silent horror. Thomas was still standing on the ledge, his eyes open but glassy, his body still twitching in a rhythmic, mechanical motion. He was still trying to push a lens that was already bathed in the morning sun. It took 3 men, and the careful application of warm oil to pry Thomas's fingers from the framework. The internal damage to his spine and shoulders was permanent. He would never carry a heavy load again, and he would walk with a pronounced, painful limp for the rest of his life. The government later awarded him a medal for extraordinary devotion to duty, but Thomas rarely spoke of that night. For the people of the coast, the light at Tillamook was just a beacon. But for the 200 survivors of the SS Vancouver, that light was the physical manifestation of one man's absolute refusal to let the darkness win. Thomas Vance had proven that even when the gears of the world shatter, the human heart can still provide the motion. The rescue of the SS Vancouver was not merely a maritime miracle, it was a testament to the absolute limits of human endurance. As the ship finally steamed toward the safety of the Columbia River, the men on the bridge remained silent, their eyes fixed on the distant, flickering light that had guided them through the mouth of hell. They didn't know that the clockwork they had relied on was actually the pulse of a dying man. Back at the lighthouse, the scene inside the lantern room was one of silent devastation. The once immaculate sanctuary of Victorian engineering was now a wreckage of spilled oil, shattered bronze teeth from the broken gears, and the crimson stains of Thomas's struggle smeared across the brass railings. The immediate aftermath was a brutal recovery. The relief keepers, arriving in the wake of the storm, found Thomas Vance in a state of catatonic shock. His body had locked into the pushing position so firmly that it took hours of careful massage and heat to return his limbs to a natural state. The physical cost was staggering: permanent nerve damage in his hands, a spine compressed by the repeated violent shrugging against 2 tons of glass, and lungs scarred by the inhalation of toxic whale oil fumes. The government, recognizing the impossibility of his feat, retired him with a full pension, a rarity in the 1870s. But the medals and the money couldn't restore the man he had been before, to 2:14 a.m. that morning. In the years following the disaster, the story of Thomas Vance forced a total revolution in lighthouse design. The catastrophic failure of the central drive shaft at Tillamook Rock became a case study for engineers across the globe. It led to the implementation of fail-safe, redundant systems and the invention of secondary manual cranks that allowed a keeper to assist the rotation without sacrificing their physical body. The age of the lone, vulnerable clockwork was over, replaced by a more resilient, industrial standard. The massive Fresnel lens itself, that intricate mountain of hand-cut glass, eventually became an artifact of a bygone era, replaced by electric beacons that required no muscle to turn. Thomas Vance spent his remaining years in a small cottage overlooking the very stretch of coast he had saved. It was said by his neighbors that on nights when the Pacific gales reached a certain, terrifying frequency, Thomas could be seen through his window, standing up from his chair. His right shoulder would twitch in a slow, rhythmic, mechanical circle. 1, 2, 3, as if his subconscious was still locked in that iron gallery, fighting a storm that had ended decades ago. He never looked at the lighthouse again. He didn't need to. He carried the weight of that 2-ton lens in his bones until the day he died. The Tillamook Rock Lighthouse was officially deactivated in the late 1950s, abandoned to the seabirds and the salt spray, eventually becoming a silent columbarium for the dead. But the legend of the man who became the machine remains etched into the folklore of the Pacific Northwest. It stands as a haunting reminder that while machines are built to be precise, they are also built to break. And when they do, the only thing left to bridge the gap between life and a watery grave is the raw, unyielding, and terrifying power of the human spirit.